Welcome to Calm and Crime. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. What I'm about to tell you happened a long time ago, and I can't say for certain whether it was 17 or 18 years ago, but it was somewhere around that time during a period of my life when I was dealing with a pretty severe depression. Even now, I have no idea how much of what happened was real, how much of it was my own mind frightening me when I was already in a vulnerable state, or whether I actually experienced something that I still have trouble believing happened. I spent some terrifying days in that cabin up in those mountains, and to this day, I still get a chill whenever I think about it, mostly because I never found a reasonable explanation for what happened there. There are parts of the experience that I can account for, things I know I saw or felt, but there are other pieces that remain completely unclear to me, and I have learned to live with not knowing where reality ended, and my own state of mind may have taken over. At the time, as I mentioned, I was going through a very difficult period, and it had become pretty common for me to disappear into one of the cabins scattered around the area. I had stayed in a few different ones already, and I actually liked moving around rather than returning to the same place, partly because one of the things I enjoyed most was finding somewhere unfamiliar where I could be entirely by myself, away from people, noise, and everything that had been weighing on me. This was my first time staying at this particular cabin, and I knew almost nothing about it before arriving. I hadn't looked into its history. I didn't know whether it had belonged to the same family for generations, whether it had changed hands repeatedly, or whether there was anything unusual about the property at all. The price was reasonable. There weren't many reviews, and under normal circumstances, I probably would have looked into it much more carefully, but I wasn't in a place where I was making decisions with the same level of caution I have today. It's easy to judge choices you made years ago when you're standing on the other side of whatever happened, but we tend to forget what it felt like to be that version of ourselves. And I don't think I was giving myself enough credit for simply trying to get through that period however I could. I've made peace with it now, and I've learned to leave that part of my life where it belongs instead of constantly picking apart every decision I made. Because at the time, I was doing the best I could with what I had. I had rented the cabin for 2 weeks, which gave me more than enough time to settle in and hopefully clear my head. I'm not particularly spiritual, but I've never been the kind of person who insists that everything I can't explain is automatically impossible either. So I've always left that door slightly open. My attitude has usually been that I don't know what's real and what's not, and I'd rather not find out the hard way. From the moment I walked into that cabin, though, I had the distinct impression that something about the place was off. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say in stories like this, but it really was how I felt. The air seemed heavy. The atmosphere had a strange, almost morbid quality to it, and there was a smell inside that reminded me of certain funeral homes. I am not exaggerating that part. When I was younger, I worked at a funeral home for 3 years, so I knew that smell immediately, even though I couldn't have explained exactly what I was smelling at first. It was the sort of scent that seemed to sit in the walls rather than simply hang in the air. And the second I noticed it, my brain took me straight back to those rooms, those long corridors, that particular mixture of cleaning products, old wood, and something else I never quite found a name for. My first assumption was that the cabin simply hadn't been aired out properly, which seemed reasonable enough, especially given how long some of these properties can sit between guests. One of the first things I tend to do whenever I stay somewhere like that is open the windows during the day, let some fresh air through, and make the place feel lived in rather than shut up. The cabin itself wasn't luxurious, especially by today's standards, but it was much larger than I expected, with 3 floors and a basement underneath the entire structure. That basement was easily the strangest part of the property. And I mean strange in a way that made me uncomfortable rather than simply curious. It was enormous, stretching almost the full length of the cabin with a wide open floor and practically nothing inside it. There wasn't any furniture, storage, equipment, or anything that gave me a reason for such a large, empty room, except for a mirror sitting against one of the walls in the far corner, covered by a sheet. I knew it was a mirror because I lifted the edge of the fabric just enough to see the glass underneath, then dropped it back into place almost immediately. There was something about that room that made me want to leave, and I wasn't interested in trying to understand why. So I shut the basement door, locked it, and even took the key with me. I remember thinking that it was probably ridiculous to be bothered by an empty basement and a covered mirror, but I also knew I hadn't gone there to investigate the property. I was there to get away from everything, and I had no reason to make myself more uncomfortable than I already was. After that, I tried to put the basement out of my mind and settle into a normal routine. I cooked, read, went outside during the day, and tried to use the time alone for what I had intended it for, which was getting some distance from my own thoughts. The problem was that as the days passed, I started feeling heavier rather than lighter. It wasn't a sudden change, more like an exhaustion that seemed to accumulate in the background until I began noticing it all the time. I would wake up tired, spend the afternoon feeling drained, and go to bed with the strange sensation that I hadn't actually rested at all. I've dealt with insomnia for much of my life, so being awake at odd hours wasn't unusual for me, but I had never experienced sleepwalking before, which is why what happened around the fourth or fifth night frightened me as much as it did. I woke up in the kitchen sometime around 4:15 in the morning, already in the process of trying to open one of the windows. I had no memory of getting out of bed, walking downstairs, or deciding that I wanted the window open. There was no sequence of events leading up to it that I could recall, only the sudden awareness that my hands were on the window and that I was lifting it. What made it worse was that opening windows at night was something I never did in those remote areas. During the day, I would open everything I could, but once the sun went down, I shut the windows, closed the shutters, and made sure there was nothing visible from outside. Being surrounded by those mountains had always given me enough reason to be cautious, and there were plenty of stories and local beliefs about what could happen after dark that I preferred to leave unexplored. Standing there in the middle of the night, realizing that I had somehow wandered downstairs without remembering any of it, I felt a wave of fear that I had never experienced from ordinary insomnia. I closed the window, went back upstairs, and I don't think I slept again that night. After that, I started taking precautions that had never occurred to me before. I began locking my bedroom door whenever I went to sleep. Not because I thought someone was going to break into the cabin, but because I was sleeping on the third floor and had started worrying about what could happen if I wandered around again without knowing what I was doing. I pictured myself walking toward the staircase while still asleep, missing a step, and ending up seriously injured at the bottom. And that possibility was enough to make me change my routine. For several nights, nothing else happened that I could point to as unusual. But the sensation of being weighed down never really went away. If anything, it seemed to become more noticeable as the days passed, leaving me increasingly exhausted, increasingly uneasy, and less certain that spending 2 weeks alone in that cabin had been the good idea I had originally believed it was. About 5 days after that first episode, when I was absolutely certain I had locked my bedroom door before going to sleep, I found myself in another episode of sleepwalking. This time standing in front of the basement door and trying to open it. Once again, I had that sudden jolt of panic when I realized where I was because I had no memory of getting there or of deciding to do any of it. As I said, I had never experienced sleepwalking in my life until those nights. First with the window and now with the door to the darkest, most unsettling part of the cabin. At that point, I decided the safest thing I could do was hide the basement key somewhere that would be difficult for me to think of, even subconsciously. I considered a few obvious places first, then chose somewhere less intuitive, figuring that if my brain was somehow trying to find the key without me being aware of it, it would probably go through those more obvious locations before ever remembering the one I had actually chosen. I have no idea whether that reasoning made any sense, but at the time it felt like the most sensible precaution I could take. The following day after that second episode, I stayed in bed for most of the day because I was starting to feel physically ill. And for the first time, I seriously considered that maybe I was coming down with the flu, or that the exhaustion from the sleepwalking combined with the depression I was already dealing with was finally catching up with me. I had reached the point where I decided that if I wasn't feeling better the next day, I was going home. I wanted to avoid ending up in a hospital and coming back with a medical bill I couldn't afford. So, my plan was to return to a familiar environment, rest, and see if whatever was happening would pass. I even started wondering whether there could have been something wrong with the cabin itself, some old paint containing something toxic, or perhaps some substance that had been left behind and forgotten. Anything that could explain why I had been feeling so strange since arriving. By then, I had already made up my mind that if things got worse again that night, I was leaving. The worst part happened that same night. I don't know how I got there, but once again, I woke up inside the basement, sitting on the floor, staring directly at the mirror with the sheet that had been covering it lying somewhere beside me. The panic that hit me when I became aware of my surroundings was overwhelming, for two reasons. First, I was in that basement in the middle of the night with almost no light around me, and the only thing I could really make out was the mirror in front of me and my own reflection. The second reason was what I saw behind myself in that reflection. There was a huge dark shape standing several feet behind me, something with what appeared to be a head, arms, and legs. Although it didn't look entirely human, I am certain that I saw it. At the same time, I know enough about what I was going through to admit that it could have been my mind filling in something that wasn't there. A hallucination, part of a dream, or some strange combination of exhaustion, depression, and sleep deprivation. I can't prove any of it, and even now I don't know which explanation I believe. What I do know is that in that moment, I experienced it as something real. I jumped to my feet and ran, looking around the basement as I did, but there was nothing there. Whatever I thought I had seen was gone, and I didn't stop to figure out where it had gone or whether it had ever been there in the first place. I got out of the basement as fast as I could, locked the door again, and by around 2:30 in the morning, I had packed everything I could carry and left the cabin. I had never done anything like that before. Even though I had grown up in that part of the mountains, I had always had a deep respect for being outside at night, especially in remote areas. And I had grown up hearing enough local stories and legends to know better than to wander through the woods alone after dark. That night, though, I didn't care. I had this overwhelming feeling that something was drawing me toward that basement and more specifically toward that mirror. And whatever the reason was, it felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. It felt heavy, hostile, almost as if something wanted me to keep going back there. I had no idea what it wanted, and I didn't want to find out. I walked for roughly half an hour through the darkness to where I had left my car, got inside, and drove home that same night. I didn't ask the man who had rented me the cabin for any kind of refund or advanced payment, and I didn't explain what had actually happened. I simply told him I had become ill and had decided to leave early. I never told anyone else either because I knew how it would sound. Even at the time, I couldn't imagine trying to explain that I had been sleepwalking, repeatedly, waking up in strange parts of the cabin, and eventually believed I had seen a huge shadow standing behind me in the reflection of a mirror in a locked basement. I didn't even tell my psychiatrist what had happened, partly because I was afraid he would see it as evidence that I was in a worse state than I had admitted and would want to extend my treatment, which would have meant costs I simply couldn't take on at the time. I'm in a much better place now, and I managed to make it through what was probably the darkest period of my life. The only person I've ever told the whole story to is my wife, whom I married about 3 years ago. She thinks it's possible that I experienced something in that cabin that we simply don't have an explanation for, but she also accepts that I could have hallucinated the entire thing, especially considering how badly I was doing mentally, how exhausted I had become, and how little sleep I was getting. I don't know which possibility is true. Maybe there was nothing unusual about that cabin at all, and my mind was trying to make sense of a situation it couldn't handle. Maybe there was something there that I still can't explain. Either way, it was one of the most frightening periods of my life. And even now, whenever I'm considering spending time alone in a remote cabin, there is a part of me that hesitates before I make the reservation. What I'm about to tell you happened this summer, and it's one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. It never would have occurred to me that something like this was even a possibility, which is actually why I'm sharing it here in the first place. Sometimes we put a lot of trust in people we know or in things that seem like a good deal, and we forget that there are situations where saving a little money or relying on somebody else's recommendation can mean dropping your guard when you shouldn't. If you're planning to disappear into the mountains, camp in the woods, or stay somewhere remote where you're miles away from the nearest town, do your research beforehand and check everything you possibly can. I'm not usually careless about that sort of thing either. What got me into this situation was partly desperation, partly the pressure of wanting the trip to happen, and partly the fact that I trusted someone I had no real reason to distrust. I should have been more cautious, and I know that now. To explain how we ended up there, my girlfriend Lacey and I had been planning a vacation in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia with my friend Mark and his girlfriend Sophie. We had done something similar before, so the idea itself wasn't unusual for us. We'd camped in those mountains in the past, spent days hiking and climbing with far more gear than we probably needed, and loved every minute of it. But we also remembered how exhausting it could be to carry everything around from one campsite to another. This time, we wanted something easier. We figured we could rent a cabin, spend most of the time exploring during the day, then come back somewhere comfortable at night instead of sleeping on the ground and hauling our entire lives through the woods. The problem was that neither Lacey nor I were in a position where we could casually spend money on a trip like that. She had started her own business the previous year, and although it was finally bringing in some money, it was still nowhere near stable enough for us to pretend we had plenty to spare. We were at that point where things could go really well over the next year, or they could go badly, and there wasn't much room between those two outcomes. If either of us got seriously sick or had some unexpected expense, we'd be in trouble. So from the beginning, we had planned the vacation as a shared expense between the four of us. About a week and a half before we were supposed to leave, Mark told us that he and Sophie weren't going to be able to come after all. He had work obligations that had suddenly become unavoidable, and Sophie wasn't feeling well. So they decided it made more sense for them to stay home. Our first thought was to cancel the whole thing because there was no way Lacey and I could comfortably afford the cabin by ourselves. It also didn't feel right to ask Mark and Sophie to pay their share when they weren't going to be there, especially because I knew their own finances were tight. A couple of years earlier, one of them had gone through a health problem that had cost them a ridiculous amount of money, and I knew they were still trying to recover from that. We briefly considered switching back to camping because that would at least eliminate the rental cost, but Lacey had injured her foot about 2 months earlier, and even though she was getting better, carrying a heavy pack for several days wasn't going to help. We had already planned to cut down on hiking because of her injury, and there was no realistic way we could go back to carrying all our camping equipment through the mountains. So without the cabin, there really wasn't much of a trip left for us. The truth is, I needed those few days away more than I wanted to admit. Work had been getting increasingly demanding. I had too many things happening at once, and I'd reached that point where I felt like if I didn't get away from everything for a little while, I was going to burn myself out. I think a lot of people understand that feeling, especially lately when so much of life seems to revolve around working just enough to cover the bills, while wondering whether you're actually building a life you want, or simply maintaining one you can afford. Lacey had been thinking about the same things, which was part of the reason she had started her business in the first place. But that hadn't exactly made things easier. There were more responsibilities, more uncertainty, and plenty of nights when we wondered whether we had made the right decision. So despite the money situation, I was determined to find some way of making the trip happen. We started looking at every possibility we could think of, trying to find something that would still give us a few days away without putting us into debt. That was when Mark mentioned that he knew someone who rented cabins for considerably less than most of the places we had been finding online. He wasn't actually a friend of Mark, which became important later, although at the time I didn't think much of the distinction. He was more of an acquaintance, someone Mark had met through a previous cabin rental. Apparently, Mark had once been interested in buying a cabin himself and had contacted this guy because he happened to have one available. The man had shown him around the property, explained the details, and given him a tour, but Mark eventually decided that the place wasn't a good investment and walked away from the purchase. They hadn't stayed in touch in any meaningful way after that, but Mark remembered that the man also rented out other cabins and seemed to offer them at much lower prices than the usual rates. I asked Mark for his contact information and told him I'd rather speak to the guy directly instead of having everything passed back and forth through somebody else. Mark sent me his number, and I reached out to him myself. From the first conversation, he seemed perfectly pleasant. There was nothing immediately alarming about him, nothing in the way he presented himself that made me think I should be concerned, and he was actually very helpful when I explained what we were looking for. He had several properties available in West Virginia, some more remote than others, and he started sending me details about the ones he thought would suit us. I asked Mark again about how they knew each other, mostly because I wanted to understand how reliable this recommendation actually was, and he explained the whole story about the cabin he had once considered buying. That was it. There was no long friendship, no family connection, no years of knowing one another. Mark had met this guy once, toured one of his properties, decided not to buy it, and remembered him when we needed somewhere inexpensive to stay. At the time, none of that seemed important. The man was friendly, the price was within our budget, the location looked beautiful, and we were running out of alternatives. More importantly, I wanted the vacation to happen badly enough that I was willing to overlook the fact that this wasn't exactly the same as booking through a well-known rental company. I looked at the photographs he sent us, went through the information he provided, and started imagining those few days away with Lacey somewhere surrounded by mountains and trees without work emails, deadlines, or the constant feeling that we were falling behind. I didn't realize then that the cheapest part of the entire arrangement wasn't going to be the cabin. I should say that my interaction with him wasn't exactly strange, but it wasn't particularly warm either. There was nothing about the way he communicated with us that made me immediately uncomfortable, although I also wouldn't describe him as especially friendly. He was more cordial than anything else, which honestly was fine. People communicate differently, and I wasn't going to read too much into someone simply having a more distant personality. He told us that he only had one cabin available that could accommodate us, and the key would be hidden in a tree near the property. That was something neither of us had ever encountered before. Every cabin we had rented in the past had either used a lock box, had the key sent to us beforehand, or required us to pick it up somewhere. So leaving a key hidden outside seemed like a rather inefficient way of handling things. Still, he explained that because we were booking with relatively little notice, and because it was the middle of summer when cabins in that part of West Virginia were in high demand, this was the only option he could offer us. He also made it clear that it wasn't the newest property he owned, and that it might be a little untidy because he hadn't had enough time to remove everything left behind by the previous guests. In exchange, though, the price was extremely low. Low enough that we were willing to tolerate some inconvenience. I went over everything with Lacey, including the condition he had described, the strange arrangement with the key, and the possibility that the place might not be particularly clean. She told me that worst-case scenario, we could bring a tent and set it up inside the cabin, which would at least give us somewhere to sleep while keeping all our climbing equipment in one place. That way, when we went out for the day, we wouldn't have to carry everything on our backs, and the fact that our actual home wasn't all that far away meant we weren't taking an enormous risk by giving the place a try. At that point, we were already committed to making the trip work, and neither of us wanted to lose the little break we had been looking forward to for weeks. When we arrived on the first day, the cabin looked perfectly livable from the outside. And in fairness, it wasn't in terrible condition once we got inside either. At the same time, there was something about the place that made it feel as though it had been left sitting there between visits for long periods of time, almost like a property that was only occasionally used and never quite returned to a normal state. The bathroom needed some attention. The refrigerator contained a few things that looked like they had been left there far too long, and there were enough small details around the rooms to make it obvious that nobody had properly cleaned up after the previous occupants. None of it was catastrophic, and it was pretty much what we had been warned about, so we decided not to make a big deal out of it. We cleaned the areas we needed to use, organized our things, and settled in. The first night passed without anything unusual happening, and the second was just as uneventful. We even managed to get some climbing in during the day, which helped make the whole arrangement feel worthwhile. The problem started on the fourth night. I woke up sometime around 3:00 in the morning to what sounded like someone trying to force the front door open with everything they had. I looked at the clock almost immediately, and before I had even properly processed what I was hearing, I realized Lacey was awake, too. We looked at each other in the darkness, both of us trying to work out whether we were actually hearing what we thought we were hearing, but there was no mistaking the sound. Someone was outside putting serious pressure against the front door, and the whole frame was rattling every time they did it. My first instinct was to get out of bed and see what was happening. But Lacey stopped me and insisted that we stay where we were. She was right. There was no reason for either of us to walk toward a door when we had no idea who was on the other side of it, and the fact that we were in an unfamiliar property in the middle of a remote part of the mountains made the idea even worse. It didn't stop with the front entrance. After a few minutes, we began hearing voices outside, although we couldn't make out what they were saying. And then came the sound of someone testing the side windows. We had locked everything before going to bed, so I knew there was no simple explanation for a window being left open or a door failing to latch properly. Somebody was deliberately trying different ways of getting inside. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell service inside the cabin, and there was nothing we could do about that from where we were. For roughly half an hour, we stayed as quiet as possible while the sounds continued around the property. Sometimes at the front, sometimes along the side of the building, never quite giving us enough information to understand how many people were actually out there. At one point, I made the mistake of looking through the window. I only raised myself enough to see outside without putting my whole body in view, and that was when I saw a man standing near the entrance, still trying to force his way through the front door. I dropped back down almost immediately because I didn't want him to realize the cabin was occupied. My thinking at the time was that perhaps if they believed nobody was inside, they would eventually give up and leave. I have no idea whether that was the right decision. And I'm aware now that there were probably several other things I could have done, but panic doesn't give you the luxury of calmly working through every possible outcome. When you're actually trapped in the middle of something like that, you react with whatever information your brain can process in the moment, and only afterward you start thinking about everything you might have done differently. Lacey was terrified by that point. She had gathered anything remotely useful that she could find, including objects with sharp edges and anything heavy enough to potentially be used if someone managed to get inside. Neither of us had expected to need to defend ourselves during a vacation, and there was something deeply unsettling about realizing that we were sitting in a cabin we had rented because it was supposed to be a cheap, peaceful place to stay while strangers were apparently trying to break into it. After about 30 minutes, the noises finally stopped. I stayed near the window and watched the man walk back toward a vehicle, get inside, and drive away. We waited for quite a while after that, neither of us willing to assume that everything was over. And by the time morning arrived, neither of us had slept. We spent the early hours seriously considering whether we should pack everything and leave. I eventually went outside to make coffee, partly because I needed something to do and partly because sitting inside and waiting for another noise was making me feel worse. That was when I saw a man in the distance running toward the cabin. He was shouting something, but he was moving so quickly and yelling so loudly that I couldn't understand a single word. I dropped everything I was holding and ran inside, locking the door behind me before he reached the property. Seconds later, he was pounding against the entrance, shouting through the door. At first, I couldn't even tell what language he was speaking. I listened for a few seconds and realized it was English, but his accent was so strong and I was so frightened that I couldn't make sense of what he was saying. Lacey had been taking a shower and came downstairs almost immediately after hearing the commotion. I told her to try calling the police if she could get any signal while I stayed near the entrance, and tried to make the man understand that we weren't going to open the door. Somewhere in the middle of all that confusion, I finally understood a few words. He was calling us thieves, and he was insisting that we were inside his cabin. That was the moment when the entire situation stopped making sense. I still don't know why I did what I did, but I opened the small shutter on the window and tried to speak to him through it. As soon as he realized someone was actually inside, he seemed to calm down slightly, although he was still furious. He told me that the cabin belonged to him, that we were trespassing on his property, and that we needed to leave or he was going to call the police. I tried to explain to him as calmly as I possibly could that we had rented the cabin, that we had paid to stay there, and that I wasn't going anywhere until the police arrived. At that point, I had no way of knowing whether he was actually telling the truth or trying to scare us into leaving so he could get us outside. And there was no chance I was going to take that risk. He remained visibly angry for a while, then eventually turned around and walked back toward his vehicle. That was when I noticed there was a woman sitting inside the car with him, and she looked almost as frightened as we were. I stood there watching them from behind the locked door, trying to understand what the hell was happening, because none of it made sense anymore. I went back inside and explained everything to Lacey, and that was when she started getting nervous for a different reason. The way we had interacted with the man who supposedly rented us the cabin hadn't been entirely normal either. And once we started putting those details together, neither of us felt comfortable assuming that this was simply some misunderstanding between two parties. We ended up waiting for roughly 2 hours before the police finally arrived. By then, the man and the woman had stayed nearby, and when the officers started speaking to everyone, the situation became much clearer. The couple were in fact the legitimate owners of the cabin. They had never rented it to us, had never spoken to us before, and had no idea that anybody was staying there. The messages we had exchanged with the person who arranged our booking suddenly became the most important part of the entire situation. So, we showed everything we had. The number he had been using was no longer registered to anyone. The account we had sent the money to couldn't be traced, and even the number Mark had originally given me was no longer connected to anything useful. It was as if the person we had been dealing with had simply disappeared as soon as we needed to establish who he actually was. Fortunately, we were able to prove that we had genuinely believed we were renting the property. We had the messages, the payment records, the photographs he had sent us, and the entire conversation showing that we had entered the arrangement in good faith. Once the owners understood what had happened, they were surprisingly sympathetic. They could have been furious, and I honestly wouldn't have blamed them because, from their perspective, they had come back to their property and found 2 strangers living inside it. Instead, they realized that we had been caught in the same situation they had just from the other side, and they told the officers that they didn't want to press charges against us. They understood that something seriously wrong had happened, and that we had been deceived just as much as they had. The owners had their own theory about what might have happened, although there was no proof behind it. They suspected that someone in their family knew exactly where the spare key was hidden and had been using the property while they were away, possibly renting it out to people without their knowledge. The location of the key made that theory plausible because it wasn't kept in a locked box or anywhere particularly secure. It was simply hidden behind that tree exactly where the owner had told us it would be. According to them, they were supposed to be away until the end of the month, which meant there would have been plenty of time for somebody who knew their plans to arrange bookings, collect money, and disappear before they returned. The strange part was that they had actually come back much earlier than expected. They had their own reasons for returning, which they didn't explain to us, and they hadn't told anyone that their plans had changed. As far as the person who had rented us the property knew, the cabin should have remained empty for weeks. That was what made the whole thing so disturbing. We had unknowingly walked into somebody else's property because a stranger had created an entirely convincing arrangement around it, taken our money, given us instructions for accessing the building, and then left us there. The people who actually owned the cabin had returned unexpectedly, found us inside, and understandably thought we were trespassers or thieves. Meanwhile, we had spent one night convinced that someone was trying to break into a place we believed we had legitimately paid to stay in. And the next morning, I had watched the owner himself running toward me, shouting without having the slightest idea why he was there. From his perspective, he had probably come home to discover strangers occupying his cabin. From ours, a man we had never seen before was charging toward us after somebody had spent half an hour trying to force their way inside during the night. Both sides had every reason to be terrified. As far as I know, the owners still haven't been able to prove that the relative they suspected was responsible. There was enough circumstantial evidence for them to be suspicious, particularly because someone had clearly known about the hidden key and the dates when the cabin was expected to be empty. But suspicion wasn't enough to establish who had actually created the fake rental. We never found out who the person behind the messages really was, how many other people might have rented that cabin through him, or whether we were simply the latest in a longer line of victims. The thought that someone could have been doing this repeatedly using a real property that they knew would be vacant is probably the part that bothers me most. We were lucky that the owners returned when they did, because if they had stayed away for the entire month, we might have gone home without ever realizing that the person we had paid had no connection to the property at all. This happened only 2 months ago, so I'm still processing it. And I know that some of my reactions probably still come from the fact that the whole thing was so recent. What I do know is that I'll never book a remote cabin the same way again. The money seemed like a lucky break at the time, and the recommendation from someone I trusted made the whole arrangement feel safer than it actually was. We were tired. We needed a break, and we wanted to believe we had found a way to make the trip work without spending more than we could afford. Instead, we ended up trapped inside a cabin we didn't own with no idea who had actually rented it to us. We were lucky nobody got hurt, and I know things could have gone much further in either direction, but that doesn't make the experience any less frightening. If I were making the same decision today, I would verify the property, the owner, the rental account, the payment details, and every other part of the arrangement before setting foot anywhere near a remote cabin. 2 months ago, I thought I was saving money. Now I know exactly how cheap a mistake can become when you don't know who is actually on the other end of the deal. The pizza delivery. My name is Chris. This happened years ago, and it's something I actually forgot about until recently. I was 17 that summer working nights at a pizza place on the outskirts of my childhood hometown. I wasn't thrilled with it, but with no money and 2 parents who would have killed me for being unemployed, I couldn't complain. It was one of those jobs you take because nothing else is hearing. Slow shifts, sticky uniforms, and a beat-up delivery car that barely made it up hills. At least I didn't have to drive my own car. That would have sucked. Not that this is super relevant, but I do want to mention that the pizza was god-awful, like genuinely terrible. I couldn't understand. Actually, I still don't understand why anyone in their right mind would order from that spot. If not for the technology and relatively nice atmosphere it provided, I honest to God don't think we ever would have gotten a single order. That place is definitely the thing I miss the least about my childhood hometown, and that's saying something. The one saving grace about working there was that because the pizza was so bad or because the place itself was so far away from our downtown or maybe a combination of the two, people rarely ordered from us, so most nights were dead quiet. I'm not going to bore you with the mundane details about how my nights typically unfolded. It was a pizza place. I'm sure you could fill in the blanks yourself. One night, I was restocking the fridge with drinks when the tablet buzzed with an online order. Large sausage and olive pizza. I remember that distinctly because we never got olives. The address was out in the middle of nowhere, past the edge of our delivery zone, and I remember getting ready to reject it out of habit. But before I could, my manager, this 30-something guy named Russell, who mostly sat in the back scrolling through Reddit, looked over and told me to take it, saying we hadn't had a single run in over an hour. I didn't argue, so when the pizza was ready, I typed in the directions on my phone and grabbed the pie. At least it would kill 30 or 40 minutes. As I was about to leave the store and walk to the car, I looked a little more carefully at the delivery instructions Russell had printed and stapled to the box, which I hadn't paid attention to until then. They said, and I remember this word for word, park on the street behind the house, walk through the backyard, knock on the back door only. That caught my attention a bit, but my 17-year-old brain thought of several rational reasons why someone might not want me to use the front door. Maybe they didn't want to wake an old person or a young child in the house. Maybe the front door of their house was being renovated. Maybe they wanted to hide the delivery from a parent or spouse. It really could have been any number of things. Plus, all I could think about was how slow the night was and how much longer it was going to feel if I sat around folding boxes. So, I just decided to do my job. But the second I stepped outside, I started having second thoughts. It was one of those summer nights that felt like walking through soup, hot, humid, and completely still, like even the air was stuck in some kind of invisible jelly. I don't know if this will make sense, but there's the stale, sour smell you get when it's really humid and still out, sort of like old plastic and sun-baked dirt. That's what it smelled like out there. I hate that smell more than anything, but it was unavoidable. I had the windows down for maybe 2 minutes before giving up and blasting the AC. The delivery address wasn't in the direction of downtown. It was actually in the exact opposite direction, even though the pizza place itself was already kind of in the middle of nowhere. The drive was supposed to take just over 25 minutes, but it felt longer because of how empty the roads were. I'm definitely exaggerating a bit. It's not like there were no houses for miles, but it was much less dense the further I drove. When I finally got to the address, I realized I was coming up behind the house. The GPS had routed me along the skinny little side street that ran parallel to a set of backyards. There weren't any street lights, and the houses didn't have back porch lights either. It was all shadows. I remember slowing down and double-checking the house number because it looked totally dead. There were no lights inside and no cars in the driveway. Just the sagging backyard with overgrown grass and a rickety wooden fence that didn't even close all the way. But still, I followed the instructions. I parked right there on the gravel shoulder, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the incline toward the back door. I had the pizza in one hand and my flashlight in the other, angling it down toward my feet so I wouldn't trip on anything. When I got to the top of the hill, I saw the back door. It was one of those old white ones with a small pane of glass at the top covered by a cheap curtain. I knocked and waited, but no one answered. I knocked a second time, knowing that my manager would be livid if I returned to the store empty-handed. After no response, I was about to knock a third time when I saw the curtain move. Not a lot, just this tiny little twitch, like someone brushed it with their finger. It was fast, and I don't think I would have even noticed if I hadn't been staring at the glass. I stood there for another few seconds, expecting the person who was clearly standing right behind the door to finally open up. But before that happened, I noticed 2 unmarked cars pull up to the side street behind my car. My first thought was that I was about to get in trouble for trespassing or something. One of the car doors opened and someone stepped out. Even from the house, I could make out that it was a man in the light of the other car's headlights. The guy motioned for me to walk over to him, which is what I did, assuming that he had ordered the pizza and that I had beaten him home from work or something. But as I got closer, I realized he was flashing me something in his hand. It was a badge. The guy was an undercover police officer, which I was able to ascertain because he wasn't wearing a uniform, just normal clothes. As soon as I got within a certain distance of him, he told me to head back to my car and wait there. That was it. That's all he said. So I did. I backed away slowly, climbed into the delivery car and sat there watching. That's when I realized there weren't just 2 officers. There were 5, maybe more. All of them had flashlights, but none of them said a word. They moved stealthily, circling the house like they were trying not to be seen. Not one of them knocked or announced their presence, which I found strange. It was a pretty bizarre sight. I remember one of the officers reaching for the back door handle, the same one I had just knocked on, and gently trying it. When it didn't open, he just nodded at one of the other guys and backed off. It felt like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see, and I guess I was. Eventually, the first officer came back to my car and crouched beside the window. I rolled it down and he looked over the pizza box on the passenger seat and let out this short sigh. He was relatively vague with what he told me, but he didn't seem like a tool, just that he was trying not to say too much. Basically, he said that there was an ongoing investigation involving that property and that he, along with the rest of the officers, were staking it out. He apologized for taking so long to intervene and told me that I had pulled up the exact time they were repositioning their vehicles. I asked if he wanted to see the delivery order and he nodded. I pulled it up on the delivery app, but I could tell it was useless. There was an associated phone number with the order along with the delivery address and the first name, Jerry, but it didn't seem particularly helpful. The officer read it, took the number down, then told me to leave immediately. I expressed my frustration to him, saying that my boss was going to kill me for returning with the pizza, and the guy just shrugged his shoulders. Then he repeated his instruction for me to leave and started walking away from the car. I was pissed, but there was nothing I could do, so I drove off. It took me the entire ride back for the whole thing to sink in. I didn't really grasp the gravity of the situation until stepping out of the car. If the police hadn't intervened when they did, something awful could have happened. I don't even know what. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the threat of the police was probably the only reason the person didn't open the door to accept the pizza. But why would someone order a pizza if they were being staked out? Maybe the person inside the house didn't know they were being watched. Or maybe they did and I was part of some test run. Like maybe I was the bait to see if the cops were watching that side of the house or if they left. The curtain moving, the silence, the timing. I don't know. What I do know is that I will never get an explanation for what happens. And thinking back to this incident is mostly a waste of time. I probably would have forgotten all about this if one of my high school friends hadn't brought it up the other week. I didn't even remember it at first. It's probably best I forget about it again, but I figured I'd share it here before that happens. The beach house. This happened just last year. I'm 40 now, married with 2 boys ages 7 and 5. I work in insurance, which sounds boring because it is, but we're stable and that's all I care about at this point in life. A couple years ago, my dad passed away after a long bout with cancer. He left behind a beach house down in Delaware that I had never been to before because he used to rent it out year-round. It's nothing flashy or big, but it's in a fantastic spot just 1 block off the boardwalk. My favorite part about it by far is the upstairs back deck that provides a really nice view of the ocean. We started going there every summer after he passed, using it as our escape. A week here, a weekend there. It became our little family tradition. As much as my wife and I love spending time there, the boys love it even more. They'll spend hours on end playing on the beach, riding bikes, and exploring the town. It feels like a gift, something my dad left behind for us to enjoy. This story takes place during one of those weeks last summer. We'd gone down in mid-July. A Sunday through Friday kind of thing when the crowds would thin out midweek and the beach was a little quieter. I remember the night clearly. It was a Wednesday. The boys had knocked out around 9:30 after a long day in the sun, and my wife and I were sitting on the back deck playing cards and sipping wine. That's when our older son, Jordan, came outside. He had this uneasy look on his face. He told me he kept hearing a scratching noise in his room, and it was keeping him awake. I glanced at my wife, then set my glass down and stood up, telling him I'd go check it out. I told my wife to hang tight. I figured it was probably just generic house sounds. It is a pretty old house after all. The boys don't share a room, so I figured there was no need to wake our younger one. I followed Jordan downstairs to his room, and he pointed to the wall near his bed and motioned for me to be quiet. We both stood there for a while, and I didn't hear anything at first, but I didn't want him to think I didn't believe him. So I stood there a little while longer. After maybe 20 seconds, I finally heard it, faint at first, but definitely there. A soft scratching sound just like he had described. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the wall. It didn't sound like an animal up in the rafters or anything. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall, lower down and closer to the baseboards. That's when I heard it, breathing. Not an animal, definitely not. It was deep, slow human breathing. I flinched back and let out a sharp Jesus, without even meaning to. And then, I'm not kidding about this, I heard the most guttural and angry scream I've ever heard ring out from somewhere inside the wall. It caught me so off guard that I yelled out again, a feeling of existential dread hitting me right in the face. I grabbed Jordan by the arm and yanked him out of the room. We ran down the hall to get my younger son, Scott, who was still sound asleep. I didn't even give him a chance to open his eyes. I just scooped him up in my arms and ran. I needed to get back upstairs to the deck where my wife was. That was the only other thing on my mind at that point. As we reached the base of the stairs, I yelled for her. And then I heard another scream come from somewhere behind me, only much closer this time. I turned around and saw a man covered in filth charging down the hallway straight at us. I nearly tripped trying to get up the stairs with both my sons, but we made it upstairs and onto the deck just in time. Not 2 seconds after I slammed the sliding door shut, the guy hit the glass full force. I genuinely thought it would shatter. He started clawing at the door like an animal, shrieking and pounding, all the while yelling things I can't bring myself to repeat. I threw my body against the door and yelled at my wife to grab the kids and call the police. She grabbed them and covered their ears, pulling them back from the scene. I kept my eyes on his, trying to block the view of him from my family. He was wild, completely unhinged. His hands smeared something. Dirt, blood, I don't even know. He smeared it across the glass as he banged and tried to force the door open. I don't know how long I held it shut. 1:05, it felt like forever. He seemingly had unlimited energy because it took all my strength to keep that door shut, and he didn't let up once. All I could think about was protecting my family. I was fully prepared to fight the guy if the glass broke. But before that happened, the police finally showed up. They must have come around the side because within seconds, I saw 2 officers inside the house running at the guy who was still banging on the door. One of the officers tackled him from behind, and the other one helped restrain him. The rest of the night was a blur. After getting that guy out of my house and in the back of a police car, the officers asked me for my version of things, which I told them. Together, the 3 of us inspected the house to try and assess how that man had been inside the walls and how he had gotten out so quickly. Turns out the house has a crawl space I didn't know about. There's an entrance underneath the back porch that you wouldn't know was there unless you were looking. From there, it leads into a standing crawl space that runs alongside the foundation and has a second access point through a loose panel in Jordan's closet. I had no idea it was there. I'd never done a full inspection of the house when I'd inherited it. Hell, I didn't even bother refinishing it. A few days later, I got more information from a detective who called to follow up. He told me the perpetrator admitted that he'd been staying in the crawl space for months, that he had discovered the crawl space entrance during the off-season, and was planning to harm my family that night for intruding on his quote-unquote new home. Apparently, The guy had been stealing food from both our house, which we somehow did notice, and our neighbor's trash bins. We didn't go back for the rest of the summer, not out of fear of something else happening, but out of trauma. I didn't want to bring my wife or kids back there for a while, and they didn't object. I hired a crew to seal off the crawl space completely, and once that was done, I was finally able to relax a little. We've been using the house again this summer, and I'm glad to say that things are back to normal, or at least as close to it as we're going to get. The stargazing. I grew up in a kind of rural area where you could ride your bike for miles without seeing another person. Like a lot of people, my favorite season was always summer. It still is actually, but it's been a while since I lived out in the country, so summer's lost a little bit of its charm. A lot of what made summer so special to me is tied to life in the middle of nowhere. There was something about the warmth, quiet, and emptiness I loved, something I could never find in the city. It's hard to explain, but I just felt so isolated, but in a good way. Like I had my own little corner of the earth all to myself. Like I could disappear for hours and no one would know. Summer nights were always the best. The darkness added to the feeling of privacy and freedom that the little girl I used to be craved. I was 16 at the time. I had a friend back then named Taylor. She was a little more reckless than me, always pushing the limits in small ways. One random night in July, we decided to go stargazing. Just us, 2 bikes, and a bottle of wine. It wasn't the first time we had done something like this. Actually, it's something we did quite often. That is until what I'm about to tell you happens. Come to think of it, this was probably one of the last times we went stargazing together. We didn't have a specific plan, just a direction. We wanted to go somewhere new since the old spots were getting a little repetitive. Taylor said she knew a good spot past the edge of town, some abandoned stretch of farmland where nobody ever would bother us. It was sometime around 10:00 when we left. I'm not sure how long we biked, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, but we didn't stop until we were past anything even remotely civilized. At some point, Taylor just stopped her bike abruptly and told me we were here. I wasn't really sure what here meant since there were no descriptive landmarks around, but it still felt perfect. Wide open field, no buildings, no fences, no cows, just a huge patch of grass and the endless starry sky. We spread out a blanket and popped the cork with the little opener Taylor had somehow remembered to bring. It was some cheap red wine that didn't taste all that good, but it did the job. We laid there for a while, passing the bottle back and forth, pointing out the few constellations we remembered by name. Our goal on nights like this was always the same: try and spot a shooting star. At one point, Taylor asked me if I thought we'd actually see one, and I told her probably not, but to keep looking anyway. They're not as uncommon out in the country where you can see so many stars, but you still have to pay attention. Shooting star or not though, we were having a great night. The wine was definitely doing its job, and I started feeling myself slipping into drunkenness. It was the kind of night that made you feel like time didn't exist. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier. This isn't super relevant to the story, but it's one of the few things I remember about the night, so I'm going to quickly tell you anyway. There was a very brief moment that felt like a blip in the rhythm of the night. We were leaning back and Taylor looked at me in this way that made me wonder if she wanted something more than friendship. Growing up, I always had that suspicion about her, but it was never motivated by anything more than curiosity. But that night, it felt a little stronger than I could recall it ever being. I didn't ask, didn't say anything. That kind of thing just wasn't talked about openly where we grew up. And besides, maybe I was just tipsy and reading too into things. Either way, it passed. We laughed about something dumb, she said, and then looked up just in time to catch a shooting star streak across the sky. If anyone has ever seen a shooting star, they know the uncontrollable reaction it elicits. Like, you just can't help but laugh or shout something out into the night. The two of us giggled, and Taylor told me to make a wish. I don't remember what it was, probably something silly. We leaned back and talked for a few more minutes, our moods a little uplifted from seeing the shooting star. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to fall asleep, just to feel the breeze on my face for a second and settle further into the stillness. I swear on my life, my eyes were not closed for more than 5 seconds. But when I opened them, Taylor was gone. Like gone, gone. Not just off to pee or fiddling with her phone. She was actually gone, which I could tell from the fact that both she and her bike were nowhere in sight, even though mine was still sitting right next to the blanket. I sat up fast, thinking maybe she was messing with me. But even after turning a full 360, I couldn't see her. In that moment, I felt this unexplainable feeling of fear wash over me. The empty field I was sitting in suddenly felt suffocating, and the gentle charm of the night was replaced by panic. The stars looked dimmer. That's the part I can't forget. The sky was still there, but it felt off, like someone had turned the brightness down or smeared something over it. And the air felt colder too. Not like it had cooled naturally, but like I stepped into a different version of the same place. I know I'm not making any sense, but like I said, the feeling was unexplainable. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was 3:00 a.m. exactly. That timestamp is burned into my memory and probably will be forever. I had to blink a few times to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. It hadn't even been midnight just a few minutes ago. I kept staring at the time on my phone, wondering if I had somehow fallen asleep. I knew I hadn't, but I couldn't be sure. Would Taylor really leave me there all alone, though? Even if I had fallen asleep, there was no way. She wouldn't have done that in a million years. I stood up, spun around, and called her name a bunch of times, but she didn't answer. I didn't know what to think. The only logical explanation was that she had ditched me for some reason. Maybe she'd gotten annoyed or wandered off and left me passed out, but I couldn't figure out why. We hadn't argued and the vibe had been good. Really good, honestly. I called her phone a bunch of times too, but those were unanswered as well. After that, I started crying. I mean, can you really blame me? I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my bike and started pedaling back towards my house, trying not to panic. That ride felt like it took forever. It was probably the scariest I'd ever felt on a bike. I didn't stop until I made it back to my driveway, completely out of breath and still not understanding what had just happened. I went to sleep immediately. The next day, I texted Taylor first thing in the morning, expecting an apology or at least an explanation, but instead she demanded one from me. She asked me word for word, "Where the hell did you go last night?" I told her what I remembered, how I'd woken up alone at 3:00 a.m. and assumed she'd left me, but then she hit me with the thing that made me send the story in. She said she was the one who had woken up alone at 3:00 a.m. and I was the one who was gone. She waited for me for over an hour, then biked home angry and confused, assuming I'd gotten annoyed and left her there. According to her, I just vanished. And I was just as convinced the same thing happened in reverse. We went in circles for a bit trying to piece it together, but nothing added up. Neither of us had memory gaps beyond that moment. Neither of us had texts or calls or anything that could help reconstruct what actually happened. Even though both of us swore remembering calling each other after waking up, none of those missed calls were in either of our phone logs. Eventually, we dropped it, or at least we stopped talking about it. But I think both of us were far more terrified than we wanted to admit. I know I was. For months, I'd find myself lying in bed looking out my window at the stars and remembering that night. Taylor and I didn't stargaze much after that night, maybe once or twice. In a sense, things did go back to normal. We continued living our lives and that was that. But even now, I still have no explanation for anything that happened that night. I wouldn't call myself superstitious or a believer in the paranormal, but everyone I tell this story to immediately attribute it to something unnatural. And maybe they're right, but I really don't like thinking about that. I do consider the possibility that she simply lied to me. Either way, I get a really unsettled feeling like something happened to us that night that I'll potentially never figure out for as long as I live. I haven't heard from Taylor for years, but I'd bet my life on the fact that she too still wonders from time to time about what happened to us that summer night in the field. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know which story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Until next time, sleep well, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling things hide in the quietest moments. Good night.